Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for those who have made it back from that wonderful curry. I'll try to keep this lively. I've got a lot to say. The slot's been cut short, so I'm going to rattle through some slides. Feel free after the event to ask me any questions that I'm not able to get through in the time allocated. So I'm talking about recent maritime pollution cases that ITOPF has attended. The image in front of you is the Stella Banner, which is an iron ore carrier that went aground in Brazil and then subsequently had to be scuppered. I think you know who ITOPF are, what we're all about, and who I am now. But just to remind you, we're funded by the global shipping industry. We're a not-for-profit organisation, and our one goal is to promote effective spill response. So we're here to mitigate pollution damage and to help out environmentally and economically. A little bit of experience from the organisation. People this week have been asking, how do we get into command posts? Why should people listen to what ITOPF has to say? Our reputation is basically goes before us, and we're a bunch of scientists, post-grad scientists, from different parts of the world, but the main thing is that we have experience of dealing with spills. So we've been to over 800 spills in 100 different countries. To build on what was said earlier this week or yesterday, the majority of incidents that we go to now are from non-tanker vessels. So you heard the ratio 1/3 to 2/3. This breaks it down a little bit into the different types of ships that we've been attending. And there's a QR code there. So lots of people have come past the booth and taken the statistics package that ITOPF has. If you want to, you would be able to get your phones out or get on the website. That will give you a lot more information other than that one pie chart. David Campion, my ITOPF colleague, said earlier, reminded you that ITOPF don't just deal with oil, either oil as cargo or oil as bunkers, but also all other types of cargoes. I talked yesterday about the traffic that goes past India, and these spots are the number of incidents that ITOPF have attended in this region, or more specifically, India. We've talked about SSL Kolkata, MSC Chitra, and Dawn Kanchipuram this week. And then more recently, just to prove that spills do still happen, maybe in your neighbouring country of Sri Lanka, but we've talked about the New Diamond, 280,000 tonnes of Kuwait export crude that fortunately did not hit the water, and the Express Pearl, which I'm going to talk a little bit about as we go through. So do spills still happen? Even during COVID times, even when there was lockdown, people couldn't travel anywhere. Was the shipping industry still working? It most definitely was, of course. Was ITOPF still involved? Yes, we were. This shot here shows that in the last 2.5 years since the COVID pandemic started, we've provided significant remote advice to the best part of 100 spills, 100 incidents. So that's 40 a year. So incidents were still going on during COVID. Help was still needed. We were able to get special dispensation and get through closed borders in certain countries, even where commercial flights weren't available. We were able to get chartered flights and to get in. Certain restrictions were lifted on quarantine from time to time. So these 15 cases are where we were actually mobilised, and I'm going to talk about some of these today. Can't talk about all of them, obviously. That top one's Felicity Ace, quite recent, in Portuguese waters, where the car carrier actually sank in the end. Another car carrier full of deluxe cars in South Georgia, the US, one of the biggest salvage operations, which took many, many months, a couple of years, in fact. And then that Peru oil spill, which you heard a little bit about yesterday from the Lemoore speaker. Can't talk about those, but I am going to talk a little bit about Wakashio, because that's been talked about this week. And we almost talk about it as though we know everything about it. Well, here we are. The vessel was basically going from Singapore to Brazil. It was in ballast, but it had the best part of 4,000 tonnes of low sulfur fuel oil on board. when she actually foundered and grounded on the reef crest at Port Desney in Mauritius. You can see here where she is on the reef crest, and you can see here the oil that came out. Basically, I mean, there was COVID. I think there was a little bit of a delay with the salvors getting there, but not too much. The swell was hitting the vessel relentlessly, and that basically meant a fuel oil tank on the starboard side, number 1, losing the whole contents of its tank. So about 1,100 tonnes were released. The other 3,000 tonnes were successfully taken off by the salvo. You can also see here on this picture that some boom just beyond the reef crest was put in place, and you can judge for yourself the effectiveness at the time of this shot. So the oil going into the bay, or looking at it from the opposite direction, so from the north looking south, and you can see the ship on the horizon, the oil coming towards you, and that's the extent of the contamination. We saw a little bit of satellite imagery and modelling yesterday. Whilst ITOPF was preparing to get to site, because we had to have our risk assessments, we had to find flights, we had to get dispensation from the Mauritian authorities to get in, we were doing this trajectory modelling. And you can see from the right-hand image that the model was saying exactly where the oil would go. And then we got the satellite image, which basically bore out what the model said. And you've seen the reality in the pictures I've given you. The at-sea response, it's a shallow lagoon from the vessel to the shoreline. So most of the oil came ashore pretty darn quickly. And what you could do in shallow waters, you obviously need shallow draft vessels. In country, there's already a Greek contractor with a relationship with the authorities. They were there who provided some of this help. There's also the French Navy came involved. You know that the Indian Coast Guard was there. The Japanese Coast Guard also sent help to the Mauritians. The oil inevitably came ashore. Part of the role of ITOPF was to map, to survey, and to see where the contamination was, the type of shorelines that were contaminated, and then to draw up a plan and to help execute it. On top of the Greek contractor who was already there, who flew more recruitment from Greece, we facilitated a French contractor also coming in to aid and do some of the cleanup. Typical shoreline, some of the mangrove areas you don't always go into clean, but there was concern of remobilization, so some of the bulk oil carefully had to be removed. Not all of the beaches in Mauritius are the fantastic resorts that you might think. There's a variety of different shoreline types, but this picture here shows you some of those aspects. A lot of manual collection was inevitably used, and also some high-volume, low-pressure flushing and hot water, high-pressure washing in other amenity areas. Main issues, it was a very low-sulfur fuel oil, so it was a little runnier, or less viscous than a traditional heavy fuel oil. It wasn't very sticky, and it stayed fresh for a longer period of time. And it meant that it could penetrate further into the substrate. Remobilization, I've said, happened. Improvised boom, you can see here that you've got sugarcane leaf, well, you can't see, but sugarcane leaves used as absorbent boom. That was useful to a degree, but there was kilometers and kilometers of it made, and actually it became waterlogged and started to sink, and then it started to abrade on the coral and then started to cause more harm than good. The bottom picture, you can see what happens if you don't anchor a boom and the wind picks up. You've got a bit of a kite. So there were issues sometimes with the boom not being used correctly. Waste collection is an issue, or was an issue for a little while, and COVID I've already mentioned. So let's go on very quickly to Express Pearl, and I am really rattling through it, Chairman. You've heard bits about this case already. You know that it was a container ship, that it had the best part of 1,500 boxes on it, of which 80 were dangerous goods. The vessel basically was at anchorage in the port of Colombo, 10 kilometers offshore. Nitric acid fire took hold. Even though the salvors got on board, they couldn't extinguish the fire. It fanned across the whole deck of the vessel. The whole vessel was ultimately consumed. Part of the ITOPF work when we were in London trying to get to site was doing the fate and behavior of the various different chemicals. So sodium hydroxide, methanol, nitric acid, what do they do to the marine environment? Where do they go? But in the end, the main concern, not the oil, and there was some oil on board, which mainly got consumed in the fire, but it was these plastic pre-production nurdles. I won't go through this particular slide. It's there for your reference with all the authorities that were in play and that were working there. Clearly, ITOPF were working with those authorities on the ship side, with the salvors, who clearly had a big job to do. And we, again, helped to facilitate bringing in contractors to help in the cleanup. And that was OSRL initially to help when we thought there might be some oil release, and they stayed on to help with the plastic collection. The nurdles came ashore within about 3 hours, and this is what you could see. Again, the left-hand side, you can see the ship on the horizon and still burning, and then you can see the waves of nurdles washing ashore, and knee-deep, so quite a quantity of them. Something like 400 containers of nurdles were on board. How much actually fell into the water, we don't actually know. Lots of cleanup done mechanically to begin with. Lots of material moved in the initial stages. The before and after all looks great. Lots of waste was generated because it's not the most selective way. So some of the nurdles got buried because of the goods vehicles. But you can see the before and after, and even the between, and when some manual cleanup was being done then in operation. Again, all the workers were Tyvek suited up in all PPE because of COVID, but you can actually see the locals on the shoreline walking in amongst the normal flotsam and jetsam that you would find on certain beaches, as well as the nurdles, and not wearing the same protective equipment. Lots of different cleanup techniques were used to try to mitigate that damage. You can see David Campion on site in that top left-hand picture, who was on stage earlier, talking with the authorities. Top right-hand, you can see sieving to try to reduce the waste. Sieving in the middle one, that's using what's known as a trommel, a rotating sieve in effect. And the other video clip on the bottom right-hand corner is a beach cleaner. Again, it's a shaking grid. You'd think it was great, lift the sand and the nurdles up, shakes the sand through, keeps the nurdles in the hopper. It works when it's a very flat, very dry beach, and you've got the right mesh size. If it's wet and bumpy, it's not the silver bullet that you would hope it would be. I'm not going to show much of this picture because I know Matthew's going to talk a lot about the GIS and the role that OSRL played in mapping in his session. The waste, 1,700 bags of waste, are still there in a warehouse in Colombo while it's been decided what to do, and I can talk a lot about that. Fisheries, David mentioned that there was a restriction put in place. Very often, restrictions are put in place and there isn't a criteria for lifting those bans. And that was a little tricky here. 450 kilometre zone was imposed, and that was withdrawn slowly, a little bit along the lines of what David was saying when we mapped out where the containers were and where the debris zone was, and we were able to subsequently reduce it back. 17,000 fishermen all having business interruption or putting claims in. We were involved in helping to assess those and also bringing in another consultant, MRAG, to come in to model the businesses and to find out particularly what the loss should be. Environmental monitoring, the authorities undertook some sampling and monitoring. They haven't been able to share that, and so there hasn't been the same cooperative approach that we would have liked. So it's quite difficult to comment on what restoration measures may or may not have been suitable. ITOPF has been working closely with them and with the P&I Club to try to get data released in order that we can advise on certain things. But now we're starting to undertake our own sampling regimes and bringing in universities from the UK to assist. So there we are, countrywide issues. All of this was going on whilst there was COVID, and all of you know very well from that your neighbour here is undergoing big political upheaval at the moment, fuel shortages, power cuts, curfews, which obviously takes a toll on everyday life, but it also takes a toll on the clean-up that was being undertaken. And on that, Chairman, I think I've gone through things as quickly as I could. My last slide, again, like David, unashamed plug. ITOPF do have an R&D award. So if you want to look that up, I will leave it at that. So I'll leave it at that without saying any more. Thank you.
Oil Spill India 2022 is dedicated to the Honourable Prime Minister's Swachh Bharat Abhiyan and Clean Seas.